The Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation will be in order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on mobilizing our cyber defenses, maturing public-private partnerships to secure U.S. critical infrastructure. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the witnesses for participating in today's hearing on how we can build a better, more robust framework for protecting our nation's most critical infrastructure. As some of you may know, this is not my first time serving as chair of this subcommittee. The last time I presided over this panel was in 2011 during the 111th Congress. At that time, the Obama administration was working to develop and strengthen many of the policy frameworks we know today, which placed DHS at the center of a voluntary public-private partnership to promote strong cybersecurity across sectors. I've also served as ranking member of this subcommittee, working across the aisle to codify many of those voluntary frameworks and information sharing regimes. With that backdrop in mind, and with all due respect to the hard work that's been done, I think it's time to be candid about the limits of these voluntary partnerships and authorities. When I rejoined the subcommittee last year, we were reeling from a massive supply chain attack that gave Russia months of access to some of the most critical networks. We've had to watch from the sidelines as our critical infrastructure, from hospitals and meatpackers to manufacturers and pipelines, have been crippled by ransomware attacks. For the past few months, federal officials, like the ones on our panel today, have been working around the clock to help private sector owners and operators understand that they may soon be the target of retaliatory Russian cyber attacks. But we have no way of knowing if these operators are hearing those warnings and taking action to shore up their defenses. From where I'm sitting, one thing is clear. The United States desperately needs to revamp the playbook it uses for critical infrastructure cybersecurity. We know that our nation's critical infrastructure is vulnerable to cyber attacks, and the federal government has resources it can bring to bear in closing security gaps. But we've been reluctant to make the private sector come to the table. The federal government also has the bird's eye view vantage point to track cyber threats in one sector, then use that information to connect the dots on other malicious activities across sectors. But until recently, we haven't been willing to require critical infrastructure operators to provide that information to CISA. While the Biden administration has taken some aggressive steps to partner with the private sector in new, innovative ways, we have a long way to go and some big challenges ahead. Fortunately, we know that Congress can still come together to tackle big challenges. Most recently, enacted cyber incident reporting legislation is proof of that. To get this legislation across the finish line, we had to work across the aisle and with our partners in industry to find a solution that would give CISA the visibility it needs without needlessly burdening victims of a cyber attack. We found a smart compromise solution there, and I have faith that we can do it again here. My goal today is to get testimony that will help us answer the question, what's next? How do we continue to mature the way the government engages with critical infrastructure, particularly those entities that are the most critical of the critical? Or, as the Cyber Solarium Commission put it, our systemically important critical infrastructure, or SICI. Do we have a good sense of where these SICI assets are, who's operating them, and how they're being secured? And once we know who and what they are, what benefits should the federal government provide for these entities to help them protect themselves? And importantly, what burdens should they be asked to shoulder in light of their importance to our national security? This latter part is key. It is not enough to simply identify these most critical entities. nor is it consistent with what the Solarium Commission proposed. We need to be able to answer the question, what do these companies need to do as a result of their designation? And what does the federal government need to do for them, whether that's better access to threat intelligence, enhanced operational collaboration, or other priority access to resources and support. It's not enough to simply make a list of our most vital assets. We need to know how we're going to operationalize it. We've tried this exercise in list making before, from the National Asset Database to the designation of Section 9 companies. Some of these efforts were costly and labor intensive, and none of them ever really lived up to the security gains originally envisioned. The through line for all these efforts is that at some point, Congress or the administration or both decided to punt on the question of benefits and burdens. That will not happen on my watch. I would like to recognize Representative Blanchfin and Ranking Member Katko for championing this issue, and I look forward to continuing to work with them to craft this legislation in a way that avoids the pitfalls of the past. This hearing is an opportunity to help move the ball forward and hear how the administration is thinking about these challenges and working to upgrade its cybersecurity playbook. I thank the witnesses for participating today, and I look forward to a robust discussion. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark, for calling this hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses. I appreciate you being here to discuss how we can bridge the gap between public and private stakeholders and to discuss ongoing efforts to identify and secure systemically important critical infrastructure. It is no secret that we are facing an unprecedented level of cyber attacks against our nation's critical infrastructure. Recent breaches like Colonial Pipeline and SolarWinds, among others, are sobering reminders of the devastation attacks can cause to our economic and national security. Additionally, yesterday's full committee hearing provided us with a stern reminder that cyber threats posed by foreign adversaries are only becoming more potent. Potential for malicious Russian cyber activity, as well as attacks by other adversarial nations like China, Iran, and North Korea, is only increasing. Congress must continue to facilitate public and private partnerships that are able to meet and repel these threats. Cyberspace is seemingly endless, and the federal government's visibility to monitor cyber incidents is limited. While Congress recently took an important step by codifying our subcommittee's incident reporting framework at CISA, there is more that can be done. The vast majority of our nation's critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. Therefore, information sharing between these stakeholders and the federal government is necessary to effectuate meaningful change. We need a process for the federal government to identify which infrastructure is systemically important, and we need a plan for the private sector to protect those assets. Earlier this Congress, I joined with my colleagues, Mr. Katko and Ms. Spanberger, in introducing bipartisan legislation, Securing Systemically Important Critical Infrastructure Act. The bill authorizes CISA to designate certain entities of critical infrastructure as systemically important. By designating key elements, the federal government will signal to the private sector the assets that they should specifically prioritize in order to secure our nation's critical sectors. As an original co-sponsor of this effort, I'm confident that this is the best path forward. I'm pleased to have an expert panel of witnesses here today to hear their perspectives on this initiative. We must create the foundation for strong public-private collaboration without adding additional regulatory burdens for the industry. I'd like to say a quick note of thanks to CISA's Region 2 team for joining me last week for a successful cybersecurity webinar for critical infrastructure partners in my district. It's information sharing like this, coupled with cyber incident reporting and systemically important critical infrastructure designation, that will be instrumental in hardening our cyber defenses. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how we can best move forward. Thank you again, Chairwoman.
I thank the ranking member, Mr. Garbarino. Members are also reminded that the subcommittee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd, 2021 colloquy regarding remote procedures. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. First, I'd like to welcome Mr. Eric Goldstein. the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Previously, Mr. Goldstein was the head of cybersecurity policy, strategy, and regulation at Goldman Sachs. Mr. Goldstein also served at CISA's precursor agency, the National Protection and Programs Directorate, for several years. Second, I'd like to welcome Mr. Robert Kanaki. Mr. Kanaki is currently the Deputy National Cyber Director of Strategy and Budget and the Acting Principal Deputy National Cyber Director in the Office of the National Cyber Directorate. During the Obama administration, Mr. Kanaki served as the Director of Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council. Finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tina Wan Sherman, who is the Director of Homeland Security and Justice at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO. Dr. Sherman manages work on the protection of the nation's critical infrastructure assets and the security of the United States transportation system. During her tenure, Dr. Sherman has led reviews on a range of critical issues, including telecommunications, transportation, and defense. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record, and I now ask that our witnesses will summarize their statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Goldstein.
Thank you so much. Chairwoman Clark, Ranking Member Garmarino, it's really a privilege to be here today testifying on behalf of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. This hearing occurs, of course, in the backdrop of Russia's unjust and tragic invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing risk of malicious cyber activity. This subcommittee is to be commended on taking the time to examine CISA's role as our nation's cyber defense agency and the manner in which we catalyze operational collaboration between government and the private sector. This operational collaboration is foundational to our success as an agency and our shared goals of rapidly advancing cybersecurity across the country. We recognize at CISA that no individual organization, public or private, has the visibility or capability alone to manage cybersecurity risk. And so our goal is to change the traditional models of public-private collaboration and move to a new paradigm of public and private operational collaboration, where we can scale more effectively to meet the risks that we are facing both today and into the future. Even as we evolve towards this model, we have already shown the benefits of true operational collaboration, where government partners and the private sector are working side by side. And I look forward today to speaking a bit more about our successes in this area and our work yet to come. The core of our operational collaboration efforts at CISA are through our Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or the JCDC, which was established by Congress to serve as the focal point for proactive planning and domestic cyber defense across government and the private sector. In its short history, the JCDC has already pioneered several real innovations. The first is bringing together representatives from the core cyber operational agencies, CISA, FBI, NSA, US Cyber Command, with partners across critical sectors, the nation's largest technology companies, energy companies, financial institutions, to sit side by side in a virtual environment, exchanging information, developing mitigations, and then sharing information to protect the broader cybersecurity community. We initiated this sort of work with the vulnerability in the Log4j software library, and we are now scaling it as part of our broader Shields Up effort in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where our goal is to bring together the best and most effective capabilities across government and the private sector so we can quickly learn about threat activity and mitigations and then share it more broadly to protect the country. We are also deeply focused on the JCDC as a locus of proactive planning. Looking briefly at our work around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in December, we developed a joint public-private cyber defense plan We exercised this plan in January, and when the invasion occurred, we moved into execution, bringing together our partners across government and the private sector to exchange information and collaborate at scale. And we are showing through this work the value of the JCDC and operational collaboration in taking information into insights, into action, all underpinned by proactive planning that brings together government and the private sector as co-equal partners through this work. And we were gratified to hear in the subcommittee's hearing yesterday, many of our partners in the private sector reflect the value of this partnership and the work that we've done, even as we mature going forward. But of course, while our core goal is ensuring that every American organization has the information and tools needed to protect their enterprises and customers against cyber risks, our core goal is ensuring the continuity and resilience of national critical functions. For this reason, at CISA, we are focused on identifying these systemically important entities, or SIEs as we call them, which, if degraded, would cause debilitating systemic or cascading impacts to national critical functions. We are engaged today in a rigorous effort to identify these entities, understand how they support national critical functions, and think creatively about how we can work collaboratively to build our operational collaboration and support these entities to reasonably assure the continuity of national critical functions under all conditions. We're grateful for the support of the subcommittee, including Mr. Katko and Mr. Langevin, in helping us advance these efforts, and looking forward to the conversation yet to come as we evolve this critical and essential work. It goes without saying that our nation is facing unprecedented cybersecurity risk, but we are deepening our relationships. We are deepening the effectiveness of our collaboration and our services, and working across government, our allies in the private sector, and with the support of Congress, we're confident that we will make the difference we need to manage risk to our country. Thank you again for the privilege of appearing today. Very much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Goldstein. I now recognize Mr. Kanaki to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark. Thank you, Mr. Gabarino, and thank you, Mr. Katko, for being here today. Very much appreciate the opportunity. It's very good to be back before this committee in my new role as Deputy National Cyber Director in the Office of the National Cyber Director. So we're the new kids in school, and we are working very closely with our colleagues at CISA. We're working very closely with our colleagues throughout the interagency and with our colleagues at the National Security Council in order to bring together a more cohesive effort on the part of the federal government when we're working with the private sector. So that's what we're here for. So today you'll hear me say a lot of things that sound almost like what you might hear from Ms. Sherman. We're reviewing, we're evaluating, we're supporting, rather than we are directing or we are operationalizing some activity. That's the role of CISA, that's the role of Eric Goldstein, and the SRMAs, the Sector Risk Management Agencies. So with that said, what I'd like to talk about is, in terms of the maturing public-private partnership, first, I think we really need to recognize how far we have actually come, particularly in the last few years. We've gone from a partnership that was fundamentally about having meetings between public policy officials in companies and public policy officials in organizations to one in which we have operational collaboration that in some cases is side by side, shoulder to shoulder, but even more importantly, has been virtualized so that people at large companies, these systemically important entities, can engage with the private sector, with the government, and can do it in real time from where they work. This is a massive leap that the JCDC has really enabled over the last year, and we're really seeing the benefits of that maturation as we confront the Russia threat. So as we look to mature, we first need to recognize that we really have come a significant way, and my hat is off to this Congress for giving the resources, the authorities, and looking at the organization of CISA and the SRMAs in order to make sure that we've got the right players on the field and they've got the right resources to do their jobs. So where do we go from here, I think, is the big question. And the Russia threat, I think, as Eric has said, is really providing a focus. It is making sure that every single day we're improving our connectivity with the private sector, that when problems happen, they're getting resolved. That if, for instance, somebody calls our office and says, we have an issue, we can't find the right place to plug into the government, we don't say, great, we'll take that, we'll stand up a new body at the White House to do it. No, we say, okay, I'm gonna get on the phone with Eric, or better yet, our engagement team is gonna get on board with the JCDC and say, how do we plug these guys in? That is happening every single day. And so that improvement is something that we very much wanna see continue as we face this Russia threat. I think Eric has given a very good encapsulation of what the JCDC does. Let me talk a little bit more about what we're doing with the sector risk management agencies, which we see as a vital partner in this effort. Many people have used the football analogy, and I'll use it here. If you've got the quarterback at CISA, you've got to make sure you have strong players on the rest of the field. And that's where the SRMAs come in. Our office is evaluating, in partnership with those SRMAs, what are their capabilities, what are the resources they need, what are the gaps, and how can we help fill them? Crucial to that, we've heard from every private sector company we talk to, is to make sure that we can provide the one thing that private companies can't do on their own, which is intelligence. Only the US government can collect intelligence, and only the US government can provide it back. So that's a major focus of our efforts. There's a great model here that the Defense Industrial Base is engaged in with DoD. We think we can replicate it. But the key is to build some connectivity between CISA and the SRMAs and the private sector so we can really scale these great efforts. I think we're well on our way to that. Finally, as I think we look at the concept of the systemically important entities, it's fairly clear to us that DHS has the authorities to do the work they've done today. We're working with them to see, are there other things you'd like to do? Are there authorities you don't have in order to either identify, but more importantly, provide support to, or set performance goals with, tailored performance goals with those entities? And so that's the last piece of what we're looking at in the very near term. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Kanaki. I now recognize Dr. Sherman to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Clark, Ranking Member Garbarino, Ranking Member Katko, and members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here today to discuss our nation's critical infrastructure alongside witnesses from 2 key federal entities in this space. As evidenced by yesterday's testimonies on Russian cyber threats and in the Comptroller General of the United States comments in front of the House Appropriations Committee, protecting the assets, systems, and networks that underpin our daily lives is a pressing and monumental task. We must safeguard not only our oil and gas pipelines, our water and food manufacturing facilities, but also our cell towers and satellites, our financial and health institutions, and more, from cyber and other attacks that occur almost daily. The owners and operators of this infrastructure, many of whom are in the private sector, work closely with the federal government to implement measures that help prevent those attacks, not only from foreign adversaries, but from domestic actors and insider threats. Regardless of their origins, the threats are real and require urgent action. The agency I represent, GAO, has reported on critical infrastructure protection in response to congressional interest for many years. In 1997, GAO first designated information security as a government-wide high-risk area, and in 2003 expanded that area to include critical infrastructure protection. Since 2021, we've issued reports on several areas where urgent action is needed. This includes CISA's transformation initiative following its 2020 reorganization, its prioritization efforts and role in supporting the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and Sector Risk Management Agency's implementation of NIST's cybersecurity framework, to name a few. One of the repeated themes that cuts across this work is the continued need to improve collaboration between the government and the private sector. The diffuse and voluntary nature of the critical infrastructure landscape continues to pose a range of challenges to this community, from implementing security standards and effectively analyzing risks, to sharing threat-related information and providing timely support and guidance to stakeholders. Though relatively new federal entities, both CISA and ONCD are uniquely positioned to play a significant role in protecting our nation's critical infrastructure. Collaboration is essential, and we have recommended to the Department of Homeland Security that it strengthen efforts between public and private partners. While the department has communicated to us that they are taking steps to implement our recommendations, we urge them to do so even more expeditiously to protect our economy, public health and safety, and national security from any future attacks. Thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting me to participate in this conversation this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Sherman, for your testimony this morning. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the time to speak today, and thank you all for being here. The most important topic. And I thank you, Mr. Garbarino, for holding this important hearing as well. The public-private partnership that CISA maintains are integral to its ability to protect the nation from cybersecurity threats. Yesterday's full committee hearing, which we had in this room, showed us that CISA's work in this space is excelling, but there's always room for improvement. We must work to ensure that CISA maintains the tools, resources, and relationships that it needs to protect our nation's critical infrastructure. Now, I've worked diligently, and as well as my colleagues have, to ensure that CISA is adequately resourced in terms of funding, authorities, and workforce, but we can't overlook the importance of the close and trusted relationships that CISA has developed with the private sector. It's just outstanding what you've done, and we've got to keep that going. Those relationships would allow the agency to collect and disseminate timely and valuable threat information in a trusted manner. Despite the passage of the cyber incident reporting legislation this year, which I think is a critical piece of legislation, which the Madam Chair was a lead on, we can't lose sight of the value of those voluntary relationships. For example, last year, CISA took an important step forward by leveraging the authorities provided in the fiscal year 21 NDAA to establish the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC. As the committee discussed yesterday, the JCDC has served as a force multiplier for our nation's cybersecurity, and it is wholly dependent on the voluntary relationship framework. Last year, I introduced a Securing Systemically Important Critical Infrastructure Act to allow CISA to more efficiently allocate its resources by establishing a thoughtful, transparent, stakeholder-engaged process to identify what truly constitutes critical infrastructure. This methodical identification process would be accompanied by prioritization of benefits for those entities deemed sicky. For the first time, this effort would move CISA away from the current first-come, first-served approach model by establishing a true risk-based approach to federal cyber assistance. While there are conflicting opinions between my colleagues and myself on the right direction for SICI, I think we can all agree that allowing CISA to maintain its close partnerships with the private sector is a keystone to its long-term success and the cybersecurity of our nation. I look forward to exploring these issues further with our witnesses today, and I thank you again for being here, and I thank, again, Chairwoman Clark and Ranking Member Garbarino for your work on these issues. And with that, I yield back.
I thank our ranking member, Mr. Katko, for his opening statement, and I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. I will remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. I now recognize myself for questions. As I mentioned in my opening, with cyber incident reporting legislation behind us, I want to use this hearing to talk about what's next. The Solarium Commission recommended a new designation for entities that are the most critical of the critical, or systemically important to our national security, which would come with benefits such as threat intelligence and burdens like security requirements. Mr. Goldstein, broadly speaking, does CISA support the concept of codifying this designation as the Solarium Commission described it, with benefits and burdens for designees, or is CISA envisioning a different approach?
Thank you, ma'am. Prioritization is foundational to our ability to protect the country against both cyber and physical threats. Within CISA today, we are focused on developing a list of what we call systemically important entities that are critical to national critical functions, these sorts of services upon which Americans depend every day to go about their daily lives. Based upon this prioritization effort, we will be more effectively able to drive operational collaboration with those organizations that have the ability, the scale, the visibility to drive down risk for the nation and prioritize our provision of services and develop new services that are most effectively tailored to support those entities that are most critical to our country. Our work in developing this systemically important entity list aligns closely to the definition and the approach proposed by the Solarium Commission. Our focus, importantly here, is on entities, who are the organizations with whom we need to partner, but the underlying philosophy of prioritization as an enabler of collaboration and an enabler of risk reduction is one in which we are wholeheartedly focused. Our priority today is ensuring that we understand these prioritized entities and we can work within our current voluntary model to ensure that we are driving operational collaboration and provision of services to drive down risk to these entities and the national critical functions that they support. We very much look forward to updating the subcommittee and your staff on our progress in developing this list and working with you going forward to ensure we have the authorities and resources to make the best use of this prioritization.
Mr. Konecki, as Congress considers this new designation, what are some of the competing priorities and trade-offs? For instance, is the goal to cement long-term operational partnerships with key partners, or is it more about developing a dynamic methodology that can be used as threats evolve, whether that's a pandemic, a hurricane, or a war in Eastern Europe?
Thank you for the question. I think we want to look at, and I think this aligns very well with where CISA is and the National Risk Management Center is, on the ability to both have a dynamic list based on current threats, as well as an understanding of what are the entities that are on a consequence base the most essential and the most important. And so what we've seen as we've worked through the pandemic, what we've seen as we've worked through the threat from Russia, is CISA and the NRMC have been able to move quite rapidly to say, here are the organizations that are most affected by this emerging threat, who are most at risk. At the same time, a much smaller list is needed and exists of those systemically important entities that are really just consequence-driven, that no matter what the vulnerabilities are or the threats are, we need to make sure that they've got the protections in place so the American people can be assured that the services and the functions they provide will continue. So I don't think it's necessarily an either or.
Dr. Sherman, excuse me, this is not the first time we've tried to identify our most significant infrastructure. Can you talk about some of the challenges GAO has uncovered with respect to maintaining these lists and making sure they're relevant and useful? How important is it that we go into this with a clear sense of the goals and security outcomes we're trying to achieve?
Ensuring that the list is valued or perceived as valued, relevant, and useful by stakeholders, both within government and the private sector, is critical. And yes, goals and strategies are also key. Based on our work, actually, both in 2013 and the work that we recently carried out in 2022, there were similar themes that we had identified with respect to the list that emerges from the National Asset Database. And the first one is concerns not only from external private sector stakeholders, but within the federal government as well, that the assets on the list are not reflective of current threats, most importantly, cyber attacks. And therefore, again, to be able to demonstrate the value of that list, it's important to make sure that it's current, relevant, and useful. And then finally, with respect to goals and strategies, it's absolutely important to make sure that it's transparent and clear in terms of what the endpoint is for having a list that's prioritized, how it will be used, and working backwards to make sure those goals and strategies are met.
Thank you. Before I yield back, I want to note how critical it is that as you begin rolling up your sleeves on cyber incident reporting, we do everything you can to expedite this rulemaking, recognizing, of course, that we also need to allow for ample stakeholder consultation and regulatory harmonization. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for his questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Goldstein, you were just talking about the voluntary relationship model, and JCDC is, I think, is a great example of what's been going on. Have you run into any hurdles in building this out? And if so, how can we help?
Thank you, sir. The collaboration that we have seen through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative has been nothing short of remarkable. In the course of our nation's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have operational collaboration, virtual environments through the JCDC with our nation's largest and most important technology companies, energy firms, financial entities, and those organizations were identified based upon their criticality, really a leading example of the sort of operational collaboration that we can drive through efforts like the identification of systemically important entities. What we have seen, and this was reflected in yesterday's hearing in the full committee, is the best way of incentivizing voluntary collaboration is for the government to show value, the government to be at the table cohesively as a co-equal partner across all of the different agencies that have different equities in this space, with CISA serving as the convening platform, as the lead for domestic cyber defense, and then providing our partners in the private sector with both the platform and the opportunity to exchange information and get real value in return. We have seen remarkable improvements even in the last 6 months in this kind of effort, and we're excited for the maturation to come.
That's great to hear. Do you think, with these partnerships, with the companies, private sector being so, willing to work with us and have this partnership, should we be concerned that these relationships might change if CISA takes more of a regulator role? If we turn it into a regulator, is that a concern that you've heard from the private sector?
Certainly, CISA's role in the current space as a trusted partner in cybersecurity, where our goal is solely to catalyze improved cybersecurity as a voluntary partner, is one that's invaluable. And that's a relationship that we work very hard to preserve and advance with partners across sectors.
The chairwoman mentioned it. The chairwoman mentioned when she talked about the importance for the rulemaking, especially with the new cyber incident reporting bill. But systemically critical infrastructures, making sure that list is up to date, as Dr. Sherman said. Do you have the resources to be able to do both right now? Do you need more? Can you tell us what CISA needs?
Absolutely. We are deeply grateful for the work of Congress and this committee for providing CISA with additional resources in the recently passed omnibus and working with us to ensure that we have a growth trajectory that aligns with the breadth of our national mission. Certainly, we know that the cyber and physical security risks facing our country continue to get more grave, and we look forward to working with the committee to ensure that in future years, our growth continues on the appropriate pace so that we can effectively address the threats we're facing.
But you feel like you'll be able to get both done?
Today, we are able to execute the mission ahead of us in the immediate future, but certainly we'll want to continue and work together to ensure that we continue growing to meet the risk.
Great. Dr. Sherman, you mentioned in your opening statement that you have a list of items that you want the agency DHS to take up. And you're hoping they implement them quickly. What's on the list? What recommendations do you have?
Sure. So based on the recent report and the comments I made in response to Chairwoman Clark, I think it's important to ensure that the list that's prioritized as a function of the National Asset Database reflects current threats. We also believe that stakeholder input is increased. We feel like it's important to make sure that state and local governments, as well as the private sector, are able to more proactively share their perspective in terms of nominations and removals as part of the list, the prioritization list. One of the things that we had found actually over the past 5 fiscal years is that in any given fiscal year, there were no more than 14 states that provided input to CISA related to the prioritized list. We think that's for several reasons, one of which is that they don't find value in the list because it's not reflective of what they think is truly important. They don't believe that the different types of infrastructure that are included on the list are consistent across states, and they have raised concerns that with respect to how the list is actually used and how meaningful it really is for them. So we definitely believe that increased stakeholder input is important as well.
I appreciate that. I'm out of time, so I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the other gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for his questions.
The other gentleman. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you all for your testimony. And I must say at the outset, Mr. Konecki, I was thinking when you were talking about how good it is to have a national cyber director finally in place again and someone that can be the coach of the whole field here. And I'm very pleased with what's going on there and with it in relationship Inglis has with the various subsets, one of which is CISA. So, and Mr. Goldstein, I can't say enough how encouraging it is to see that CISA is developing those really trusted and treasured partnerships with the private sector. It's so critical to their mission, and the more we can develop that trust and the trusted exchange of information, by far, we're going to make this whole cyber landscape safer. So it's in that vein that I have a couple of questions for you. And obviously, we're all concerned about infrastructure in general and systemically important critical infrastructure in particular, given the threat that Russia now poses, an increased threat. So I wonder if you could give us an update on the current state of the effort to define SICI, as you will, which is not the best acronym, by the way. And I know that's why CISA came up with the Pisces acronym, and I want to figure out what the two are. So why don't you explain to us what the two are and how they work together, and maybe give us, after that, give us a little bit of the private sector input, if you would.
Great, thank you, sir, of course. At CISA, through our National Risk Management Center, we are currently focused on developing our list of systemically important entities. And these are organizations that own, operate, or otherwise control critical infrastructure that, if degraded, would have a debilitating systemic or cascading impacts on our national security.
So just to interrupt you just for a second. I think that's so important because if all critical infrastructure is systemically important, then nothing is, right? So we have to take the most critical of the critical. Is that basically the effort we're trying to do here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, go ahead.
And importantly, sir, there's a few important nuances with the definition that we're utilizing at CISA. The first, as I mentioned at the outset, is our focus on entities, because we need to figure out the organizations with whom we are partnering. And so focusing on entities allows us to use this prioritization to actually drive collaboration and drive provision of services to those organizations that we need to help. The second important aspect is this idea of cascading effects or systemic impact, which means that we can look at some of these smaller organizations, or organizations in the supply chain that are deeply critical, but actually might not have as much revenue or market share as others in a given sector. And the third piece, which really is critical, is the tie to national critical functions, these services upon which the American people and businesses rely every day to go about our daily lives. And by tying the entity list to national critical functions, that then lets us do the rigorous analysis to figure out how do we keep these functions at the end of the day available and resilient, which really is why we're all here. Today, our National Risk Management Center has developed a rigorous methodology to decompose our national critical functions into these lists of systemically important entities. That work is ongoing, and our goal here is for this to be both a rigorous and strongly methodological approach, but also one that is transparent and gets input from our partners in government and the private sector to ensure, to Ms. Sherman's very well taken point, that we have, that the list is understood and credible by those organizations who are so designated on the list.
Yeah, it's a little, just can drill down a little bit more on the private sector input. What is the nature and quality of the input you're getting from them right now, or asking for?
So thus far, we are still at the fairly early stages of that process. We are beginning to reach out through our sector fora to get input on the methodology and the process. As this work evolves and we generate the underlying lists for national critical functions, we do intend to do robust engagement with our sector partners with whom we work so closely to ensure that both the methodology is understood and the outputs therefrom.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and I appreciate that. I really strongly encourage you to continue your collaborative effort with the private sector. Mr. Konecki, is there anything you want to add to that? Your microphone, please.
I'm sorry, sir. Just that we're working very closely with CISA as we try and understand what additional authorities they may need in order to further this work. And I think we have a good sense of where they are today and what they've been able to do under current authority, and we need to work with them to identify, are there additional authorities that would help them do that kind of deeper level identification you're discussing?
Thank you very much. I know I'm out of time, but I just want to say, Ms. Sherman, I appreciate very much the work that your office does, and please keep it up because your input's very valued, and we want to let you know that, even though I didn't have time to ask you a question. I yield back. Thank you very much.
The chair will now recognize other members for questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. In accordance with the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd colloquy, I will recognize members in order of seniority, alternating between the majority and the minority. Members are also reminded to unmute themselves when recognized for questioning. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Let me thank the chair very much for this hearing and the ranking member as well on the committee. Let me pose questions as I listened to ranking member Katko's question. Let me ask all three, starting with Mr. Goldstein, and then following Mr. Naki and Ms. Juan Sherman. I would appreciate if they were brief because I have a series of questions, but I really would like to know the gaps in the authorities that have impeded previous efforts to identify and boost the security of critical infrastructure. We've been on a long journey on this, and we certainly have been on a long journey as it relates to critical infrastructure. I remember doing this in the early 2000s and looking at water and other forms of the electric grid, but really looking at it from probably a very naive perspective. What is happening now? What impedes you from having the fullest comprehensive review on this vast critical infrastructure subjected now to dangerous operators such as those housed in Russia?
Thank you, ma'am. Congress, led by this committee, has done an extraordinary job over the past few years of providing CISA with new and robust authorities for us to conduct our mission as the nation's lead for domestic cyber defense, whether that is establishing the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative last year, whether it is providing the authority to establish mandatory incident reporting requirements this year, or even going a few years back, providing us the ability to issue subpoenas to identify the operators of vulnerable devices or protect information.
Right, but let me interject to say that I want to go. I thank you for recognizing that. I would like to ensure that we know what else we need to do.
Yes, ma'am. At this point today, we are focused on fully implementing the authorities that we have been provided, including those that were just recently provided this year through the Congress and good work of this committee. Very much looking forward to working with this committee and your staffs to ensure that any gaps or impediments as they emerge are rapidly identified and we can work with Congress to address them.
All right. Does anyone have any specific that have not answered, Mr. Naki or Ms. Juan Sherman?
Thank you, Congresswoman. What I would add is it's a gap, but we don't necessarily know at this point whether it needs to be filled. So I want to be careful in making this point. Right now, DHS wouldn't have the capacity to do what might be called a census. They wouldn't have the capacity to go out to critical infrastructure, say, provide us this information back, and then we'll evaluate it. Now, whether they need that authority, whether they need that information is an open question. They've got a lot of other data sources that they can pull on to identify critical infrastructure at this point. And so I think it's an open question as to whether or not that kind of census-like activity would really actually be important.
I think that's an important point you made. Let me just change the question for you, Ms. Von Sherman, and ask about the narrative dealing with Russia and the example of Colonial Pipeline. They were housed in Russia. Obviously, Russian government at that time indicated that they, as a government, were not involved. But in light of the horrors in Ukraine and the seemingly ramping up on the Russian government's sort of negative operations that may include cyber attacks as they've done in other countries, what do we need to do here in the United States domestically?
One area I would like to speak to has to do with CISA's role as the national coordinator for the sector risk management agencies. This is a space that we are starting to look more into at GAO. And at this stage, we believe that CISA has several opportunities to be able to more proactively engage with those sector risk management agencies and as a sector risk management agency itself for multiple sectors to be able to bring them along in terms of implementing and carrying out their responsibilities from the FY21 NDAA and to be able to improve the information sharing as well as coordination within the sector and across all of the sectors to ensure that there is a more informed understanding of the key issues in the various sectors, especially in the lifeline sectors and those specific to the concerns that you're raising here with respect to Russia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Mrs. Harsh-Barger.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. I do have a question for Mr. Kanaki. As we're all aware, there's a new incident reporting law on the books, but that doesn't mean we can lose sight of the importance of the voluntary relationships between CISA and the private sector. I guess my question is, should Congress be considering any additional incentives that could be used to enhance the two-way dialogue between the federal government and owners and operators of critical infrastructure? And the reason I ask that is I have multiple companies within my district. When I go visit, they tell me they have had cyber attacks and been hacked multiple times, and they just go ahead and pay the ransomware and don't report that to the FBI. So there's probably reasons that they don't report that, and of course they don't want their customer base to think they can't protect their information. Of course, the stocks go down, and they don't want to be hauled in front of Congress. But tell me what you're doing to make that a better private partnership with these government entities, sir.
Thank you for the question. It's a really important one. I believe as part of that bill, one of the things that CISA was instructed to do that we are part of is to establish a new ransomware task force that's going to look at these issues. And so I believe we're on a fairly tight timeline to get that stood up and to start figuring out how we can make sure that ransomware is treated as the national security priority that it is, and that our government, which is often very focused on these large systemically important entities that affect the entire nation, is providing support, is providing services, and is providing incentives to those smaller businesses that are really the backbone of the economy. And so that ransomware task force, which Congress has mandated that we will play a large role in and that CISA will lead, is absolutely essential to that activity.
Well, it absolutely is. We were in the SCIF talking about the cyber threats from Russia, and one of my colleagues asked, how will we know when we're hit? And they said, well, we'll know when we're hit. So is there anything we can do to preemptively stop that? I think about, and I talked about TVA in my district and how they, I talked to their CEO and how they protect the TVA system, basically, from attacks as far as the grid or EMP and things like that. But cyber is a very big threat, and they said they were protected. So, you know, it's a little bit worrisome that you won't know until it happens. And the first hearing I was ever in is, you remember that we had 9 government agencies hacked and they didn't even know it. And we had Microsoft and FireEye and SolarWinds. And I'm like, what can we do to protect these private companies and our own government? It's worrisome. Anybody have a response?
Yes, ma'am. I'll offer a few points on that. Great question. The first is, we really collectively need to push a cultural change in how we think as a country about cyber incident reporting. It is terrific that Congress has provided CISA with the authority to mandate reporting, but even in lieu of that requirement, or while that requirement is being executed through a rulemaking, organizations need to understand the value of reporting incidents to the federal government, which is, of course, first so that the U.S. government can offer assistance if needed, but it's also so that we can help understand the breadth of campaigns and contain them before other organizations are victimized. That's why at CISA, we've had our Shields Up campaign for months now, really evangelizing this perspective that if you see anything unusual in your networks, tell the US government, tell CISA, so that we can help understand, is this actually the leading indicator of a foreign adversary campaign? And also why at CISA, it was wonderful to hear Mr. Garbarino talk about his meeting with our Region 2 colleagues, because we have regional representatives throughout the country who every day are knocking on doors physically and virtually and explaining the value of proactive voluntary reporting. And again, CISA is not a regulator in this space, and so our goal exclusively is to ensure that organizations know how to protect themselves and to help identify intrusions so we can help safeguard others.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer, and with that, I'll yield back.
The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Good morning. Madam Chair, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting this very important hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today and for the exceptional work you're doing in protecting our nation's cybersecurity. And let me just associate myself with remarks from the ranking member and complimenting CISA on how closely you're working with private sector entities to make sure that they are secure. And also applaud you for the work you've done under Director Easterly's leadership on and Director Goldstein and standing up the Shields Up program to make sure that we're prepared for any blowback and threats from Russia. So let me start with Mr. Kanaki. I believe that one important factor in considering SICI or other public-private cybersecurity partnerships is the degree to which those partnerships need to be shaped by the cybersecurity maturity of the entities that are involved. So a critical infrastructure entity's in-house cybersecurity capability will affect really the utility of different kinds of assistance the government can provide. For many resource-constrained critical infrastructure entities, technical assistance and other CISA services can be extremely valuable. But other critical infrastructure entities have a much higher degree of cybersecurity maturity, including many of those that I would construe as systemically important critical infrastructure. For those entities, the return on investment of technical assistance would be lower, whereas access to more actionable cyber threat intelligence to inform their own defenses would be more helpful. So, Mr. Kanaki, how is ONCD thinking about this issue in the context of promoting operational collaboration with systemically important critical infrastructure?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a great question. I think you're right. If you look at a lot of the systemically important entities. These are very well-resourced organizations for cybersecurity. They purchase many of the services that CISA could provide to them. That's not where they're looking for support. They've got their own red teaming capability. They've got their own threat hunting capability. And it's probably more important for CISA to deploy those resources strategically to the organizations that are important or systemically important, but don't have the kind of budget that, say, some of these larger entities do. When we talk to these large systemically important entities, the thing that they really do emphasize is that intelligence piece. What's the one thing that they're not allowed to do, right? They cannot go out and collect foreign intelligence in the way that the U.S. intelligence community can. That would be illegal for them to do. They understand that, but yet they see the need to collect that kind of threat intelligence, have it shared with them, have it operationalized by them. So I think that's the critical important piece here. What we're looking at is what are the opportunities to really move that into real time? How can we move from situations in which we're saying, come down to the SCIF at the FBI office, wherever you're located, and we'll give you a brief, to how can we get this out to you in a secure form that you can use to protect your network? There's a lot that we can do. There's a lot that we have done to declassify data, to push it out broadly, to push it out widely on the internet. And I applaud what CIS has done in that regard. Yeah. But we're really trying to look at how could we actually, with these systemically important entities, really bring them into some kind of collaborative environment where we could trust that that environment is secure and this kind of information can be shared.
Yeah, and that's why I think the joint collaborative environment, which the Solarium Commission has recommended, and which is a top priority for me this year, would create that common tool set for sharing information in real time and understanding context. But for both of you, based on testimony we've heard today, it's clear that CISA's systemically important entities effort is engaged in a rigorous identification process, but the next steps of what to do with the list appear less clear to me than the Solarium Commission's vision of SICI, which recalls for specific benefits and obligations to SICI entities. So while an accurate identification process is important, we must also have a clear picture of the policies and strategies that will govern and strengthen the partnership between federal government and our most critical infrastructure entities. So for Mr. Kanaki and Mr. Goldstein, if CISA develops a list of systemically important entities, what does the administration plan to do with it? And how would those factors like cyber maturity, as we discussed today, play a role in where and how the government would prioritize its efforts to partner with critical infrastructure owners and operators?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. And as ever, thank you for your leadership on this critical issue. We are focused on utilizing the SIE list for two main purposes in the first instance, recognizing that one value of such a list is that its applicability will evolve over time as the risk environment changes apace. But the first is to use it to drive operational collaboration and bring together organizations across sectors, across national critical functions, into the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative to enable that sort of risk reduction efforts that we are already doing with highly critical entities across 3 sectors in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As the SIE effort expands, we'll be able to do that prioritized collaboration more effectively. The second piece is focusing on supply chains with these key SIE entities to ensure, to Rob's very well taken point, if an organization doesn't need U.S. government risk reduction services, we can understand their dependencies and their supply chains to reduce their risk going forward.
The gentleman's time is expired.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time is
Thank you, Madam
expired.
Chair.
Thank you to Mr. Lanchman for all of your dedication and hard work in this space. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Thanks for being here. And I echo my comments that Representative Langevin, Representative Katko are 2 members who have a ton of in-depth knowledge on cyber, and it's really difficult to think of both of them not here next term. Wanted to take kind of the 40,000 foot view for a second. And, I think unfortunately, what I hear from people in my district more often than not is they have no idea, who in the US government is protecting them from cyber attack. They feel like they're on the front lines, that they're being attacked all the time. And their government, they just don't know, like, who is the 911 call? What does it look like? These folks who are protecting me or trying to protect me. They know what a police officer looks like. They know what someone in the military looks like. So I would just put a note in that we need to also communicate to the American public, not just within Washington circles, kind of what we do, what you all do to protect people. But I want to talk about two sectors that we haven't talked about very much. One is the agriculture sector, and second is K through 12 schools. In the ag sector, obviously JBS, the ransomware attack last year, was a really big deal. I come from a district with a ton of farmers, and it was like the first thing on their mind when I brought the Secretary of Agriculture last summer. So my understanding is there's not an ISAC or like a community of folks that are focused on cybersecurity in the ag world. Can you tell me briefly, first and foremost, what you are doing or what reassurance we can give farmers that our food security systems are protected and being looked at? And then secondly, K through 12. It is just amazing. You get 10 superintendents from my district together. Every single one of them has been the victim of a ransomware attack. Every single one of them is desperate for tools to protect our kids' data. So tell me what we're doing in those two sectors, please, if you could.
Certainly. Both great questions. Regarding the food and ag sector, certainly the ransomware intrusion affecting JBS put in stark relief the impacts that a cyber intrusion on the food and ag sector could have on the availability of the food supply to the American people. I actually personally met this week with a number of the largest meat producers in the country, and this sector is one that is of paramount importance to our collaborative efforts. Our goal with the food and ag sector, as with other sectors, is to work really closely with those organizations and their security leadership that account for the preponderance of food production, food distribution, food supply in this country, understand areas of needed improvement or areas where we can help advance their cybersecurity programs, and then ensure that they are getting the specific services, tools, and information from CISA and our partners, including USDA as applicable, to meet them where they are. And so our goal with this sector is to really partner with the organizations that contribute to the related national critical functions to ensure that we are providing them with everything we can to shore up their security. K-12 cybersecurity, ma'am, as you note, is an absolute urgent issue. We know that many K-12 school districts lack the resources and maturity to secure their networks in many cases against sophisticated threats. Congress thoughtfully anticipated this issue in passing the K-12 Cybersecurity Act, which directed CISA to conduct a study on this very issue and assess how we can provide more effective services and tools and information to the K-12 cybersecurity community. That work is ongoing and very much looking forward to briefing the subcommittee on our conclusions. But this is an area where our regional team members at CISA have so much value because we know.
Yeah, I'm a co-sponsor of that legislation. I think I would offer that our cybersecurity community, which is doing yeoman's work and trying to gain all these connections with these different sectors. It's one thing to come and testify. It's one thing to kind of have conversations about what you're doing in a forum like this. I would offer that part of the responsibilities of your agencies is to also communicate out to normal people who have no idea how to keep themselves safe. And I would just ask that you maybe look at your budget on this matter and redouble your efforts to communicate to real people who don't understand what you all do and how it protects them, and how that should be, how their responsibilities fit into that, right? Making sure they're doing everything they can on cyber hygiene. So thank you for that. Thank you for your work, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman for her line of questioning. Wanted to recognize the ranking member for a follow-up question. I myself have a few follow-up questions, so I yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino.
Thank you, Chairman. Are you sure you don't want to go first, or whatever? I can go. Okay. Mr. Goldstein, you started answering this question before, and Ms. Sherman brought up when she talked about the sector risk management coordination and how you're going to work together with these other agencies. And I know you've already started, CISA's already started some programs like through the Section 9 list, and the U.S. Department of Energy has begun initiatives to strengthen resilience in the energy sector. What is CISA's plan to make sure that all the sector risk management agencies have a say in determining what is systemically critical infrastructure, and to make sure everybody's kept up to date and everybody's reading from the same sheet of music?
Yes, thank you, sir. The SRMAs are critical partners in really everything we do at CISA, but particularly when we are identifying systemically important entities, SIEs, the SRMAs fill two essential roles. The first is helping us make sure that the methodology that we are using for identification in the first instance incorporates the relevant expertise from each SRMA so that we are not underweighting or overweighting different variables that might contribute to getting a suboptimal list for a given national critical function. But then essentially, when we have a list established for a given national critical function, the SRMAs are critical partners in figuring out how do we, as a US government, bring together everything that we can offer to improve the security and resilience of entities that are supporting a given NCF. And critically in this space, in CISA's role as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure security and resilience and the lead for national cyber defense, that does not mean that we are the sole actor in providing these services and information. The SRMAs in many cases have unique sectoral risk management expertise, particularly regarding understanding how a cyber intrusion or physical event could impact the continuity of a national critical function. And so by partnering with the SRMAs, we can combine CISA's generally applicable expertise in both cyber and physical security with the sector knowledge of an SRMA, and that's the combination that we believe adds real value to sector entities.
I appreciate it. And just a question, Ms. Sherman, do you have any ideas or suggestions on how to make sure that there is no confusion?
Sure. Well, maybe two quick points related to the SRMAs. The first, as discussed yesterday during the hearing, there's a range of maturity levels when it comes to sector risk management agencies, spanning from, for example, we talked about the financial services sector all the way to the water sector and everything in between. So I think it's important for CISA to be able to work to bring along those less mature sectors and to work with the relevant SRMA in those instances to make sure they have the support and resources and coordination needed. The other point I wanted to raise actually is around the update to the national plan and the sector-specific plans. The national plan has been in place since 2013, and CISA is actively undertaking an update effort. I think by the end of this year is the goal. One of the things, though, in conversations that we have had with sector risk management agencies is that they are holding still in updating their sector-specific plan until the national plan update occurs. And so we do think that this is something timely and important for CISA to continue to act on so that those updates, and again, the relevancy and the value of the guidance that's being provided to the sectors and the steps that they need to take will be laid out in those plans and is something that they can act on.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Goldstein, I have a couple of clarifying questions before we close. First, CISA is working to identify systemically important entities. Right now, does CISA have the authority to compel any SIE to share information about security measures they have in place?
No, ma'am. At this point, we do not have the authority to compel organizations to share cybersecurity information. Our focus is on building these trusted partnerships in which organizations voluntarily work with us to share information that we need to understand and manage cybersecurity risk.
Does CISA have the authority to compel information about their vendors or supply chains?
Currently, we do not have the authority to compel private organizations to provide CISA with information about their vendors or supply chains.
Does CISA have the authority to compel any other information it may need to fully assess an SIE's relative security risk or vulnerability?
Today, CISA does not have such authorities to compel private organizations. We have narrow authorities, ma'am, as you're aware, for our subpoena authority to compel disclosure of voluntary devices being used by an organization, but certainly not specific to the security controls in place by an SIE. Certainly, those authorities may exist elsewhere in government, but not within CISA.
So what kind of information enhanced CISA's understanding of national systemic risk?
Our approach today is understanding the entities that contribute to the continuity of national critical functions, bringing those organizations in. I think it's relevant to note here that in our view, the US government and the private sector has a shared interest in ensuring the continuity and resilience of national critical functions. Thus far, we have shown great success in building trusted partnerships in which we have a shared goal with the private sector to ensure continuity and resilience of NCFs. And by building that trust, we are able to catalyze information sharing to the degree needed to execute our mission.
And secondly, do you anticipate that the concept of SICI or systemically important entities will replace the list of Section 9 entities?
We certainly envision the SIE process as an evolution or maturation of the Section 9 list, where tying the list to national critical functions and focusing on cascading and systemic impact will be an improvement over the Section 9 process and allow us to drive operational collaboration more effectively.
So do you anticipate a replacement or just sort of archiving? How do you sort of manage all that information?
Our goal would be that if we achieve our intended outcomes with the SEI list, that the SEI list would resolve the need for a separate Section 9 list. Ideally, the SEI list will meet the intent of Section 9 of EO 13636 and allow us to do even more with the critical prioritization of entities across the country.
And if Congress were to codify the concept of SICI or SIEs without also replacing new requirements on also placing new requirements on designated entities, how would that list be different from the existing Section 9 program?
So today, our work to develop the SIE list differs in important ways from the Section 9 program, including tying the SIE list back to national critical functions, ensuring that we are encompassing the breadth of critical sectors. For example, the IT sector was excluded specifically from the Section 9 program in the underlying executive order, as well as focusing on cascading and systemic risk so that we are not only identifying the largest entities in the country, but also ones that, by virtue of their unique dependencies or relationships, pose a potential risk to the continuity of national critical functions.
Very well. It's my understanding that we have an additional question or questions from Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas. You're recognized at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this very good hearing. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record several articles. SolarWinds to Log4j, the global impact of today's cybersecurity vulnerabilities, April 5th, 2022. TechCrunch, Apple, iCloud, Twitter, and Minecraft vulnerable to ubiquitous zero-day flaw. Biden signs an executive order aimed at protecting critical American infrastructure from cyber attacks. And Biden warns U.S. companies to gear it up against Russian hacks. I ask unanimous consent, Madam Chair, to include that in the record. Thank you so very much. I'm going to go again to CISA and reflect on the testimony that you gave that indicated you made great strides in establishing joint cyber defense, CISA cybersecurity advisory committee, etc. Can you give examples, just pointed because I have other questions, of the significant strides that CISA has made through the establishment of this joint cyber and the CISA Cybersecurity Advisory Committee? And then if you would answer, is this joint cyber defense collaborative in authorization language? Would you answer that, please? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, of course. Let me answer the last part first. So yes, Congress established a joint cyber planning office in the National Defense Authorization Act 2 years ago. The JCDC is the maturation of the joint cyber planning office using the same underlying authorization passed by Congress with the leadership of this committee and of course, Mr. Langevin. We have had actually remarkable successes with the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative thus far. Ma'am, I'll reference in particular a few of the articles you've noted around our response to the Log4j software library vulnerability. We brought together, frankly, within hours, many of the largest technology companies in the world to understand what technologies were impacted by the vulnerability, the cyber defense measures that were effective in mitigating the risk of the vulnerability, and then we set up broadly applicable and widely disseminated websites and product that we share with stakeholders across the country and indeed across the world, driving mitigation of the vulnerability at scale. We could never have done that work without the insights that we were able to glean and enrich from our private sector partners in the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. We are now doing very similar work, but even more at scale around the risk of—
Thank you.
I'm sorry, ma'am?
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Ma'am.
Ms. Juan Sherman, let's go back to my premise about the bad actor that Russia's become, so much so that you can't distinguish between Russia's violence and cyber attacks from the criminals that are lodged in their town. I want to pursue your line of statements that you made when I asked you previously, and your point about that the federal government needs to include strengthening the federal role in terms of dealing with the critical infrastructure, strengthening the federal role in protecting the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, and improving priority setting efforts. Having in your mind the backdrop of Russia's rising threat, could you further enhance that comment, please? Ms. Juan Sherman?
Almost made it through with getting, without doing that. Apologies. Yes, at this stage, some of the other findings that we had come across in our review highlighted, for example, some of the challenges with the National Critical Functions Framework, which looks to have promise, and it is great to hear all of the perspective and efforts that have been carried out and are underway as a part of that framework. The concerns that we have identified as part of that particular framework is making sure that there's a clear understanding both within, again, the federal government and all of the levels of government and the private sector of exactly what the priority setting looks like, how the priority setting is going to actually be carried out, what the goal of the framework is, and what impact there might be on planning and operations. I tie that back to your question related to Russia and the Russia cyber threats in thinking about the various sectors and all of the functions that cut across those sectors, and the importance of making sure that the private sector entities and all of the levels of government have a clear understanding and awareness of what actions that they would need to take and where they sit in terms of planning and operations. And so it's definitely an area that we had made several recommendations in, and we think it's important not only for the broader framework effort, but for some of these very real-time incidents that are occurring.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I intend to introduce legislation and look forward to working with you around this zero-day potential that has been looming for so many years and now maybe even more of a threat. Thank you for yielding, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. With that, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members that the subcommittee record will remain open for 10 business days, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.